June 6, 1944, 4:30 a.m. Aboard HMS Belfast, the English Channel. The sea was a restless, slate-gray canvas, churning under a sky still bruised with the fading dark. The air, a bitter, salt-laced wind, snapped against the bridge of the light cruiser, HMS Belfast, carrying the distant, guttural thrum of thousands of engines. Below, the invasion fleet, the largest armada the world had ever seen, moved like a silent, implacable tide towards the French coast. The scale was dizzying. 6,939 vessels, from battleships and destroyers to landing craft crammed with nervous, steel-helmeted men. The immense, audacious gamble known as Operation Overlord was fully underway. On the bridge, the tension was a palpable thing, thick as the morning mist. Rear Admiral Robert Burnett, his face grimly set in the pre-dawn gloom, stood hunched over a chart table, the glow of a hooded lamp casting long shadows across his worried features. He commanded Force E, the supporting fire for the Eastern Naval Task Force, and the minutes before dawn were the longest of his life. Every man knew the stakes. They were sailing into the crucible of Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall, a defense system designed to bleed them white. The pre-invasion intelligence, while extensive, was no guarantee against the hidden nests of machine guns, the submerged obstacles rigged with mines, or the sheer, desperate resistance of the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, 100 miles away in London, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was already awake in his underground war rooms. But his vigil had begun hours earlier, in the deep night, when the first waves of the sky-borne invasion force, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the British 6th Airborne Division, had begun their terrifying descent into the darkness of Normandy. He had waited for the initial, fragmented reports, the crackle of static, the terse codes indicating drop zones, the gut-wrenching confirmation of aircraft lost. Churchill knew the sheer logistical complexity of the operation, the myriad of moving parts that could, and often did, fail in the chaos of war. He was a man who understood the arithmetic of risk better than almost anyone, and the odds of success on the beachheads, according to many planners, hovered precariously. The first muted rumble of heavy naval bombardment began just after 5:30 a.m. It was not the shattering, continuous roar of an artillery duel, but a measured, relentless percussion that vibrated through the hulls of the ships and into the cold Channel water. On Belfast, Admiral Burnett watched the eastern horizon. The sky, finally lightening to a pearly gray, was being stained orange and black by the distant concussions. It was the sound of destiny, the sound of the world changing, but it was also a sound of dreadful uncertainty. How many of the 130,000 men poised to land would make it across the deadly stretch of sand? Churchill, still in the war rooms, received the first key message detailing the airborne success. The reports were tentative but promising. Glider landings largely successful, key bridges seized by Major Howard's British paratroopers, Operation Tonga, and the American parachutists, though scattered, were consolidating and causing havoc behind the German lines. The news was a necessary tonic, but the true test, the amphibious landing against an alerted enemy, was yet to begin. He knew the Führer's immediate counterattack could still doom the entire enterprise. The PM had spent the morning oscillating between the war rooms and his flat, reviewing detailed maps, his mind a whirlwind of contingency and consequence. He needed more than fragmented reports. He needed a clear picture of the beach assaults, the losses, and the German reaction. He had arranged to address the House of Commons that afternoon, but he could not walk into that chamber with mere rumor. He required certainty, or at least the closest thing to it available on this longest day. The weight of millions of lives, the lives of the fighting men and the fate of the free world, rested on the next few hours of chaotic, bloody combat unfolding 100 miles away. The sun had finally broken the horizon, illuminating the invasion with its harsh, unforgiving light. The daylight did little to lift the heavy cloak of ambiguity that defines the opening hours of any massive military operation. By 7:30 a.m., the first waves of infantry had hit the 5 designated beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The reports flooding back to General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF, at Bushy Park were a horrifying mix of success and catastrophic failure, a classic example of the fog of war at its most intense. For Churchill, relying on updates filtered through SHAF and relayed by liaisons in the war rooms, the initial picture was agonizingly piecemeal. The news from the British and Canadian sectors, Gold, Juno, and Sword, was initially encouraging. At Juno, the Canadian forces, despite hitting submerged obstacles and facing heavy fire from the German 716th Infantry Division, managed to breach the seawall and push inland. Losses were high, but the momentum was established. Similarly at Gold, the British 50th Division, backed by specialized armored vehicles known as Hobart's Funnies, made significant headway, neutralizing key strongpoints. These early triumphs, though bought with blood, offered a much-needed ray of hope to the strategists in London. However, the situation unfolding at Omaha Beach, the American sector, was a nightmare that threatened to unravel the entire operation. Delayed by choppy seas and hampered by insufficient pre-landing bombardment, the troops of the USV Corps landed directly into the sustained, interlocking fire of the well-entrenched German 352nd Infantry Division. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Landing craft were destroyed before they could disgorge their cargo. Men drowned under the weight of their equipment, and those who made it ashore found themselves pinned down on a narrow strip of sand, subjected to a relentless hail of machine gun fire and mortar explosions. Colonel George A. Taylor's desperate plea was transmitted back. 2 companies are knocked out. We've got to get these survivors off the beach. For hours, the situation was so dire that General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, considered withdrawing from Omaha entirely, a decision that would have been calamitous to the overall plan. Churchill, waiting in the confines of his London headquarters, understood that the sheer weight of information, thousands of reports, intercepts, and eyewitness accounts, had to be compressed into a single, coherent picture before he could address the Commons. Lord Ismay, his chief of staff, worked tirelessly with intelligence officers to synthesize the raw data. They were not looking for detail, they were searching for the trend. Was the enemy mounting a coordinated counterattack? Were the beachheads holding? Had the massive naval and air support succeeded in suppressing the heavy German coastal artillery? By noon, the situation began to clarify, though the cost at Omaha remained a horrifying asterisk. The successful landings at Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword meant that 4 out of 5 sectors were secured, allowing for the crucial buildup of follow-on forces and supplies. Crucially, the German counterattack was not yet coordinated. Hitler's indecision, coupled with the Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Wehrmacht that the main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, bought the precious hours the landing forces needed. This delay, born of tactical brilliance and enemy confusion, was the hinge upon which the early success swung. The cable sent to Churchill just after 1 p.m. confirmed the momentum, emphasizing the lower-than-expected overall casualty figures, excluding the extreme outlier of Omaha. Armed with this cautiously optimistic assessment, the Prime Minister prepared to face Parliament, knowing his words had to inspire confidence without promising a swift victory. The real battle, he knew, was just beginning. The House of Commons at Westminster, usually the venue for raucous political debate, took on a cathedral-like atmosphere that Tuesday afternoon. Every seat was filled. The galleries were packed with diplomats, journalists, and military observers. The mood was electric, charged with anticipation, anxiety, and a profound collective hope. For 5 years, Britain had stood alone, then fought alongside its allies across deserts and oceans, and now, finally, the long-awaited return to the European continent was underway. The silence that preceded the Prime Minister's entrance was deafening, broken only by the rustle of official papers and the strained breathing of those waiting. Winston Churchill, dressed in his customary blue pinstripe suit, entered the chamber shortly after 3:30 p.m. His face, usually a canvas of emotion, was carefully composed, a necessary mask of measured assurance. He held a prepared statement, though much of what he would say was already meticulously weighed and memorized. He understood the profound rhetorical power he wielded. His address could not merely be a bulletin. It had to be a psychological anchor for the nation and a clear message of intent to the world. A boastful announcement could lead to devastating disillusionment if the operation faltered, while excessive caution might dampen the much-needed morale boost. The tone had to be one of sober, powerful confidence rooted in undeniable facts. Before he spoke, he paused to read the final summary handed to him by Sir Alanbrooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The summary reiterated the key successes: the integrity of the Allied air superiority, the establishment of 5 beachheads, though Omaha was still tenuous, and crucially, the relatively low rate of initial casualties across the British and Canadian sectors, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The term satisfactory was the key operative word chosen by the military chiefs, implying not triumph, but solid, successful execution of the plan's first phase. Churchill rose to speak, his famous, resonant voice filling the chamber, which instantly fell silent. He began by placing the invasion in its proper context, acknowledging the magnitude of the undertaking. He spoke not of victory, but of a decisive step. The exact words he chose were calculated to reassure and inform simultaneously. He stated plainly, "I have been at the centers where the latest information is received, and I can state to the House that this operation is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner." The phrase "thoroughly satisfactory manner" was a masterful piece of understatement. It spoke volumes about the scale of the success. For any operation involving over 130,000 men assaulting a fortified coast to be merely satisfactory was, in military terms, miraculous. He immediately followed this with the most encouraging tactical news. The airborne troops are well established, and the landings and the follow-ups are all proceeding with much less loss, very much less, than we expected. This specific detail about lower casualties was designed to cut through the inevitable fear of a bloodbath that pervaded the public consciousness, stemming from the memory of earlier, disastrous amphibious attempts in the Great War. The relief that swept through the chamber was palpable, manifesting as a controlled, deep exhale from hundreds of witnesses to history. But the relief was not allowed to last. Churchill knew the battle's true fury lay ahead. Churchill's narrative pivot was immediate and deliberate. Having offered the crucial assurance that the initial phase had gone better than anticipated, he quickly steered the attention of the members of Parliament towards a future of hard fighting, immense complexity, and unpredictable turns. He was keenly aware that the immediate psychological lift provided by the news could quickly deflate if the public believed the worst was over. This was not the end, it was barely the beginning. He needed to prepare the nation for the inevitable, grinding struggle to come against a formidable and cornered foe. His powerful, measured voice took on a deeper gravity as he delivered the necessary caution. But all this, although a very valuable first step, a vital and essential first step, gives no indication of what may be the course of the battle in the next days and weeks, he declared. The emphasis was not on victory, but on the battle. He used terms like vital and essential to highlight the success achieved, but ensured they were immediately qualified by the ominous phrase "no indication," grounding the optimism in a harsh reality. He was reminding them that the forces ashore were still vulnerable, clinging to a precarious foothold against an enemy whose heavy armored divisions, particularly the elite SS Panzer units, had yet to be fully committed. Intelligence reports from that morning, filtered through signals and aerial reconnaissance, confirmed that key German reserves were moving, albeit slowly and hampered by intense Allied air interdiction. The Panzerlehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend were the ghosts in the machine, the main threat that could, if deployed correctly, push the Allied forces back into the sea. Churchill knew that the success of the invasion now depended on the Allied troops breaking out of the coastal plain before these armored forces could arrive in strength and organize a devastating counteroffensive. He continued, painting a picture of the immense challenges: the need to consolidate the beachheads, clear the port of Cherbourg, and secure a sufficient volume of supplies across the beaches to support a sustained campaign. The logistical complexity of getting hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and millions of gallons of fuel across a narrow channel, and into combat was a feat that risked failure at every step. "It is, therefore, a most serious time that we enter upon," he warned. This was not the time for celebration, but for renewed resolve. The atmosphere in the Commons shifted from one of exhilarated relief to one of solemn determination. Churchill was managing expectations, preparing the populace for a potentially long, brutal war of attrition in the hedgerows and dense terrain of Normandy, the bocage. He made it clear that while the entry had been successful, the fight to stay was going to be the defining struggle of the summer. His final words in this section, however, were an embrace of the alliance, a powerful reminder of the unity sustaining the effort, acknowledging the sacrifices being made not just by Britain, but by America, Canada, and the other allied nations now fighting shoulder to shoulder on French soil. The message was clear. They had taken the first hill, but the mountain range lay ahead. Churchill concluded his address with an affirmation that transcended military strategy, rooting the vast operation in the strength of the partnership that made it possible. He knew that the success of D-Day, and indeed the entire war, hinged on the unwavering cooperation between the key leaders and fighting forces. He chose to end on a note of deep gratitude and unbreakable fellowship. "Thank God we enter upon it with our great allies, all in good heart and all in good friendship," he pronounced, the resonance of his voice conveying the immense relief of knowing Britain did not stand alone against the might of the Nazi regime. This statement was far more than a polite diplomatic courtesy. It was a recognition of the operational harmony between the British, American, and Canadian forces, a harmony that had been forged in the crucible of countless meetings, tense arguments, and the shared purpose of defeating tyranny. The phrase "good heart" spoke to the morale of the troops, the strategic resolve of the commanders like Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Tedder, and the collective spirit of the home fronts. The phrase "good friendship" was a direct nod to the essential unity of the Western powers, demonstrating to the enemy and the world that the coalition was solid and determined. As Churchill sat down, a wave of cheers and applause erupted from the House of Commons. It was not a celebratory roar, but a deep, rolling sound of acknowledgement and profound relief. He had delivered the news without undue embellishment, managing the delicate balance between necessary confidence and responsible caution. The address was immediately broadcast, transcribed, and flashed across the globe, defining the moment for a world desperate for news of the liberation of Europe. Outside the chambers, the long day of June 6th was drawing to a close. As twilight fell across the channel, the flow of landing craft continued relentlessly toward the secured beachheads. The logistical challenge was now paramount, getting men and material across the water and inland, establishing communications, and dealing with the constant threat of German counterattacks, particularly from the promised deployment of the Luftwaffe, which, thankfully, had failed to materialize in force. Across the war-torn landscape of Normandy, the men who had survived the beaches were digging in, their initial objectives met, but their fate still uncertain. For Churchill, the announcement was merely a brief respite in a nonstop vigil. He returned to the war rooms, where the reports continued to pour in. The sheer scale of the achievement, establishing a bridgehead against the strongest coastal defenses in history, was a strategic masterpiece. Yet, the price had been paid in blood, particularly at Omaha, where the final casualty count would be counted in the thousands. The thoroughly satisfactory manner was a testament not to ease, but to the extraordinary courage and sacrifice of the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had turned a desperate gamble into a decisive first step. The battle for the continent had begun, and the Prime Minister, though buoyed by the day's success, knew the war's most brutal chapter was just opening. The vigil would continue for many days and weeks to come.